Hi, this is Kowski for AP Gov, and in this video we're going to be looking at how bills are marked up and eventually passed, or basically eventually are killed. And a lot of that has to do with the committee system, which we talked about in one of the previous videos. So here are the learning objectives straight out of the College Board's AP Gov curriculum. And with respect to legislation, bills, there are about 11,000 bills proposed every congressional session, give or take, several hundred. And remember, in the committees, that's really where the real work of Congress begins in terms of analyzing legislation. So they will hold hearings, they will mark up the bill, meaning change it, cross something out, add something in, or if there's a bill that really, they just don't have time to get to because of this many bills, the committee might pigeonhole it, meaning that they forget about it and it never makes it out of the committee, thus it is dying. And as you see, this graveyard of both Senate and House bills. Now, not every committee, of course, gets 11,000 bills, but they do get several hundreds, depending on the nature of the committee. And it's just impossible due to time constraints in the calendar for the committee to see every single bill. Another important thing that committees do, as we know, is legislative oversight, where they monitor the bureaucracy. Are they carrying out the law as Congress intended to? Are they administering the policy? And so they will conduct hearings on that. And of course, as publicity value of receiving credit for controlling spending has increased, so too has oversight. So certainly we've seen Congress want to monitor the bureaucracy a little bit more closely, especially during these fiscal times where politicians are trying to cut the budget wherever they can, although that really does not happen all that much. Now, in addition, it is important to note that typically we see more legislative oversight when there's some type of major event or catastrophe. A good example would be the BP oil spill. You then had congressional hearings. Was BP doing something illegal? Was it not following regulations? Or you might even hear of legislative oversight when Facebook had its privacy issues. They called in Mark Zuckerberg and they held committee hearings on that. So certainly the committees play a major role in legislation, but also legislative oversight as well. So getting on the committee is very important because you have a major role in that committee. Is something going to be heard in your committee? You control the calendar in that committee. That's a huge role in terms of scheduling hearings, hiring staff, appointing subcommittees, etc. But ultimately, how the chairperson is selected is based on the seniority system. The longest time that you've served on that committee ultimately determines if you are going to be the are you going to be that committee's chairperson, assuming that you are the party in control. So if the Republicans have the majority and you're the longest serving member on that committee, you are now the committee chair. All right, so Congress and bills. Since Congress is so large, especially the House of Representatives, they often form what are known as caucuses or coalitions. And these are a group of members that have some shared interest. And some of these examples that you can find are the Black Caucus, Native American Caucus, Sun Belt Caucus. They have some type of, issue that is binding them. Sometimes they are also bipartisan. You don't see that too often, but it does happen. And what these coalitions will do, they'll pressure the committee meetings and hearings for votes for bills so that they don't get pigeonholed. Now, coalitions and caucuses tend to be much stronger in the Senate simply because if you're a senator, you're serving for 6 years as opposed to the House, which is just 2 years. So that coalition or caucus is going to be growing stronger in the Senate because you're around those people much longer, as opposed to the House. And in many ways, they can be much more effective than lobbyists because, again, lobbyists are not congresspeople. And these congresspeople are going to be pressuring their fellow congresspeople to put a bill through committee. So they certainly do have a major influence as to bills that get expedited or maybe even killed, depending on the nature of that bill. Now, it's important to note that the committee doesn't do it by themselves. A lot of them have personal staff. Keep in mind that the staff is used to organize hearings, research, and even write legislation. And this could even make them the target of lobbyists in terms of giving them what the lobbyists want. Sometimes lobbyists will actually present congresspeople with the actual bill that they want them to pass. Like they literally write it out. So sometimes that does happen. Now, they also do have staff agencies that we'll look at on the next slide, the CRS, GAO, and the CBO, which all provide information to Congress. It's important to note that there's more than 30,000 people in the bureaucracy that help Congress with these bills. So as many as 3,000 people can be involved in the process of one bill. So the information that's provided to Congress comes from the CRS, providing nonpartisan studies, research facts, the GAO, providing financial audits of money spent by the executive branch departments, investigates agencies, and again, it's making sure that the legislative intent of the law is certainly being followed. And then you also have the CBO, which is probably better known, and it advises Congress about the possible economic effects of programs and policies. So, for example, how much will this proposed bill cost the U.S. government? And they will try to provide some type of estimate to provide further information to Congress people as to, how you should vote in terms of it on a fiscal basis. Okay, so the congressional process. Again, 11,000 bills on average are introduced. Only 5% become law. That is a very, 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 very low threshold. It's important to note that anybody can draft a bill in Congress. However, you have to be a member of the House or in the Senate. The president cannot propose a bill. An interest group cannot propose a bill. A lobbyist cannot propose a bill. Only somebody in the Senate or the House can. And as we said when we were distinguishing the House from the Senate, the House certainly has more rules. It's more structured compared to the Senate. And party leaders certainly play a major role in both chambers of Congress, but you see it much less in the Senate. The Speaker of the House certainly has a more pivotal role in the House as opposed to the Senate Majority Leader. But I cannot underscore enough the number of influences on the legislative process, from interest groups, the lobbyists, the president, especially if the president wants a certain bill passed. And not to mention, of course, as we said, coalitions and caucuses. So how a bill becomes law, it has to be introduced in either the House or the Senate. And it's going to go through the subcommittees where it's marked up. It then has to go through committees. And note that in the House, as we said in the previous video, that it has a rules committee that marks it up in terms of how long is the debate going to be, other rules that you're going to attach, can you have germane amendments. And if it passes through each part, it will then go for a full vote in the House or a full vote in the Senate. So once that bill clears the Senate, it then goes to the House, and it goes through the same process. If it's lucky enough to pass the House, you go into what's called a conference committee where you're going to reconcile the differences between the two bills. It then will go for another full vote in the Senate and the House with this new one unified bill. And then ultimately the president is going to sign it into law or veto it, in which case it's law, or Congress is going to override it or not even try. So there are many, many steps. That's why 5% of bills become law. But certainly it's important to note that congressional leadership assigns the bill to the committee. It marks it up. They can pigeonhole it. They hold these hearings, as we said. They sometimes get tabled. And again, if it's in the House, it will be sent to the Rules Committee, which is unique to the House of Representatives, unlike the Senate, which it would go directly for a vote there. Now, again, keep in mind with the House Rules Committee, it's going to review the bill before going to the full House and getting out of committee. And it's going to have rules in terms of time for debate, amendments that can be offered. So even if you might have an amendment on agriculture, it will specify how many types of amendments, or, what's specific to agriculture can, these additions to the bills be offered. Now, they have what are called close rule, which is sometimes referred to as the gag rule, which forbids amendments on the floor. It has strict time limits, and it's important to note that usually the close rule is utilized. On fewer occasions, you do have the open rule where it does allow for amendments, and again, fewer time limits there. But it's important to note that in the House, all amendments, again, what you're adding to the original bill have to be germane. It means it has to be related to the bill. So you try to put an amendment that's completely unrelated, not even close to the topic, and one's about transportation, then you're trying to put something dealing with, let's say, taxation. Well, that's not very much related to that. So again, it has to be germane. Now, there are times where something's used called the discharge petition, where it's signed by 218 members of the House. Again, remember, we're only talking about the House here. Before the floor. Again, this does not happen much, but it forces a bill out of a committee that does not want a bill to go forth. But if you get 218 members, you might think, why 218? Well, 218 is just a simple majority out of 435 members of Congress. So the whole idea of a discharge petition is it prevents a minority, that being the committee, from stopping a majority, 218 members, on advancing a bill, and thus they can circumvent leadership. And when, of course, the House is voting, a quorum, meaning a majority, a simple majority, has to be present. You can't just be voting with 10 people, because that obviously is not a majority. Now, bills in the Senate, formed to protect the elite interests, temper the House. That's why the Senate was certainly formed under the Founding Fathers, but certainly they have this unique rule where they have the filibuster, which helps the minority simply have unlimited debate to prevent the Senate from voting on a bill, thus killing it if time runs out. Now, one way to stop a filibuster is when 60 members, but this has now been reduced to a simple majority today, can stop a filibuster by voting for cloture. So if you just have a simple majority that can end cloture, well, then that will force the bill to a vote. Now, the amendments and riders for bills in the Senate do allow add-ons. They don't have to be germane, unlike the House. They can be related, sometimes they're not. And sometimes you get what are these called Christmas tree bills that attract many often related floor amendments. And if you look at this Christmas tree here, sort of the Christmas tree bill, because it's what every senator wants in a bill, because it's going to basically be benefiting them in some way or another. Now, some criticisms of Congress is that there's too much pork. There was one instance in where they were going to build a bridge to nowhere. It was a $200 million bridge for 9,000 residents. So talk about pork, meaning these benefits from member districts. There was also another example of the Consolidated Appropriations Act where it funded 11,000 projects. Talk about a huge pork bill right there. Now, why this happens is typically if a member of Congress wants support from somebody else, they say, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. Basically, I'll support your pet project in return for support of my own. And then you have these earmarks where part of that spending bill is for that specific pork. So again, it is important to look at the many criticisms of Congress in that respect, as we see. So final stages, the president can sign it, veto it. Sometimes the president doesn't want to take an action, so they pocket veto it, where the president has 10 days to act, and without action, the bill actually dies. Now, presidents no longer have this, but it's called a line item veto, where the president could basically just cross out certain things that you don't like and leave other things in there. Many states don't have this. One state that does is New Jersey. It's also important to note that there are sometimes signing statements where the president is going to be writing positive or negative comments concerning a law. Again, does not happen all that much. Sometimes they do. Clinton used it a lot, as you see here, 300 times versus Bush just 150 times. So they might say, hey, part of this bill is unconstitutional and I'm not going to enforce it, even though we're going to be passing this law. So the president is basically giving their opinion on that bill. So again, just to recap in terms of how a bill becomes law, it's either going to first go through the House or first go through the Senate. If you recall, all bills dealing with revenue and taxation have to start in the House. So let's just say we have a proposed tax, it goes through the House, it is introduced, and then the Speaker of the House is going to assign it to a subcommittee. In this case, it would probably be the Ways and Means because it's dealing with taxation. So the committee is going to mark it up, and assuming that it doesn't get pigeonholed and it makes it out of committee. And again, these committees are, not 435 people. They're much smaller. So if it's voted out of committee, it will then go to another committee in the House, known as the Rules Committee, and they will attach how long it will be debated and, amendments and closed rule, open rule, as we talked before. And the full House will vote on it. If it passes, then this basically, the bill is going to be introduced again through the Senate. Same process, it's going to be assigned to a subcommittee, and if it gets out, then the Senate Majority Leader is going to put it up for a vote on the calendar, and if the majority of senators say, yes, we like that bill, and it gets passed, well, the issue here is now you have one bill dealing with the taxation that's marked up differently than this bill in the House that's marked up differently. So how do we reconcile the differences? We go through a conference committee in which you reconcile the differences between the two bills. Once it gets out of the conference committee, the House votes on that same bill as well as the Senate, and if it is successful, it will then go to the President to be signed or vetoed. And if it is vetoed, the Congress can certainly override it, although that is very difficult with the 2/3 requirement, so that typically does not happen all that much. So if the president does sign it, it becomes law. If it does not, most likely it will not become law and it will die.